Good to go.
Oh, stop. On camera already? All right, well, thank you so much, everyone. Good evening, ladies. I was going to say ladies and gentlemen, but good evening, ladies. How are you guys this evening?
Good.
Excellent, all right. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. I know it's really nasty outside. I know it's rainy and cold and all that, but thank you so much for making the effort to show up. I really appreciate it. Thank you to Deanna and the Washington Glen Library to allow me to take part in the big read. Hopefully everyone's read the book tonight. There will be a test later on. No, there will not be a test. What I'm going to do, and by the way, my name is Dr. Hector Montford. I teach history at the College of Coastal Georgia. I teach U.S. history and Latin American history and something called public history, which is where we learn or where we teach students how to teach history to the general public and not inside of the classroom. And tonight, what I wanted to talk with you guys about, and give you some background information on, is the idea of how myth and history share no connection whatsoever. The book that we've read or are reading deals a lot with mythological people, ideas, places, and that sort of thing. And as I was reading through the book, it got me kind of thinking about what kind of topic would I want to talk about to an audience about myth. And it dawned on me that people use myth to understand not just the past, but to really understand the present. They use myth to tell them why they are here, where they are, why they're there. And to a certain degree, we use history to do that as well, right? We use history, we use the past to kind of inform us about the future. What's the line? What's the motto? Those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it, right? That's the idea. But as I was thinking about that, the historian in me, the researcher in me, said, no, there's a difference though between myth and history. There's a difference between something that's set in stone that pertains to Zeus, the god of, the god of thunder, lightning, and that kind of idea, as opposed to the idea of history and the past, and our past. And so what I wanted to do, and why I called this Mythbusters, was to explain why, even though we rely on history in order to allow us to understand where we are now in our lives, and use the past to kind of compare things to now, what I wanted to do is explain why sometimes the past we think we know, the past you may have learned whenever you were younger, whenever you were in your teens, or whenever you were in your teens, why that past now maybe doesn't jive necessarily with the way history is told today. So we've heard about this before, right? The idea that history is changing. The way we teach history now differs from the way history was taught to me whenever I was 14 years old. And so what I wanted to do was just kind of explain why that change happens. Now, this is not something new. The idea of history changing all the time, is pretty much part of the basis of historical research. And so that's what I wanted to get across to everyone today. Basically, this is a class you would take in grad school on history called historiography, the study of the writing of history. And you took that class at the grad school level, you read a lot of books. You would read a lot about how Greek historians thought about history one way, how Christian historians thought about history another way, how people began to think differently about the idea of the study of history as time went on. And you would understand more about why history changes, why the facts are the same, the who, the when, and the why generally remain the same. But the why in history, which is the most important, the most fun part of history, why things happen, that is what changes over time. And so I want to kind of hit on that to explain that a little bit in this story. So that's where we start with this. Well, we'll start with myth, actually. And the idea of what myth is. I've kind of talked about it already. But myth essentially is used, we've used myth in the past, civilizations have, to describe the world around us. Especially whenever we didn't know exactly why things happened, we could tell a story about it. That would give us a reason why that was there, why that mountain was there, why those stars were there, why the sun moved across the sky, right? Apollo in his chariot moves the sun on a daily basis, that kind of idea. And the best thing about myth is that myth never changes. Myth stays the same. No matter how far in the distant future you go, you're still telling the same story. Apollo is always the same. Sisyphus, the man who pushes the boulder up the hill every single day, only to have it roll back down. He continues to do that for generations. We never have futility. Those kinds of ideas never change. So they have a grounding necessarily that people can use and experience later on in life, later on in generations to come. But history is different. History does change. There it is. We'll start talking about why history is different from myth. Because history does change. This is a long quote from a man named James McPherson, a historian of prominence in the history circles. And he explains what history is necessarily. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. But essentially what I want to point out, what Dr. McPherson is pointing out, is that history is a continuing dialogue between the present and the past. We're always talking about or thinking about the past. And because of that constant dialogue, we're always learning new things about the past. And because of that constant dialogue between us in 2021 and events, say, in 1875, we'll learn something different. And that dialogue allows us to learn different things and to tell different things. Part of being a historian is not just learn something new, but to explain it. McPherson goes on to explain, or to say here, that, not being all of this, there is no single, eternal, and immutable truth about the past events and their meaning. In other words, unlike myth, which never changes, which is always based in stone, history changes. History is malleable. The story can change over time. And so we use history, again, to tell us about our past, to kind of explain why things are the way they are. But at the end of the day, we're using this whenever we know the sand, or the ground underneath us is sand, and it will shift over time. Some people call this revisionism, the idea of history changing over time. You guys have probably heard that term before, revision. Never in a good way, most likely. Revisionism is never seen as a positive thing. It's a term critics use to criticize and complain about the way, quote, the history changes. And so what I want to do now, in the next bit of time, next hour or so, is to explain that change and why it's happening over time. So, this is where the historiography of all this comes in. I want to explain how history has traditionally been taught, then explain how it's being taught more and more. So, if you look at the story of history and the teaching of history, where you can really kind of lock in a time and say this is the modern version of what we think of as history, is in the 19th century, especially the latter part of the 19th century, the middle to late 1800s, when our history becomes a profession, where you can get a PhD, teach in a college, you have a historical field. There are certain ideas in place about what historians do. If you want to learn something about the past, you go to the archives, you go to the museum, you look at records, you look at artifacts, and then you write your history. That was the traditional view of history, the one that's going to be around for the longest period of time in our story. In this kind of history, the most important subjects, the most important themes and topics pertain to big picture stuff. The idea of politics, of war, of economics. These were the big picture history subjects that historians study. Like, for instance, George Washington here with his horse. The idea, traditional kind of joke about this type of history is that it's always about great white men on horses with swords. That's the study of this kind of history. And honestly, it has its appeal. It's always fun to read about this kind of stuff. Whenever I was, a younger child, I, cut my teeth reading about Civil War history, American Revolution, World War II. That was the exciting stuff that got me into history. Much like everybody else who learned history, That's where you kind of first learn about what history is. In fact, this teaching of history is going to be the predominant version of history taught at the college level and the grade school level from basically the late 1800s up until around the 1970s, maybe a little bit earlier. The idea of the great man in history, the idea of politics, war, and economics. I mentioned the word great man just to tell you a story about this. There was a theory within this study of history that is called the great man theory. That there was a spiritual energy that led men to become great for a moment in time, to change the world, and then went away. This is a theory in history around the same time period, maybe a little bit earlier. The general example of this is a man named Napoleon. You all heard of Napoleon, probably. The idea was that the spiritual energy from the outside enters Napoleon, compels him to do what he does, conquer Europe, try to conquer the world, and so on and so forth. And once the spirit was done with Napoleon, it left him, it made him a husk of a man who was sent to Elba, where he eventually died. The idea of the great man theory, where you are great for a moment because of some outside force that comes into your body, compels you to do things that defeat you. So this is some of the stuff we're talking about during this time period. But in this history of great men like George Washington, like Napoleon, whenever you talk about generals like Eisenhower and Patton, what's missing in that story?
Everyone else.
Everyone else, yeah, us, right? At least me, I'm not a great man, so I would not have been a subject of historical research in 1905. That's the part that's missing. And what's going to happen is that over time, people will begin to think about that. And will begin to look less at the great men of history, and again, it's always men, and begin to look at other aspects of historical record, of the people involved, and the way the world has changed over the years. This starts in England and in France in the 1920s or so, and the idea becomes what is known as social history. Social history differs from the big picture history like of these people like Washington and such, in that social history focuses on everyday people who work in the factories, people who work on the farms, men, women, children, people who didn't lead lives of adventure, who didn't make important political decisions. Instead, social history focused on their everyday lives. This is radical at the time. Because now we're talking about everyday people and what they did. We care less about the great governments, the great people involved, and now we're going to start talking about the average everyday person. Now what this does is that it expands the idea of what history is and who makes history. And so suddenly now, when you start writing about everyday people, when you start writing about the factory worker, when you start writing about the seamstress, when you start writing about them, the history opens up. And the story kind of changes. It becomes more emotional as well. In America, this will catch on in the 1930s and really catch on in academia by the 1950s and 1960s. This idea of social history. One of the first big social history movements is undertaken by the U.S. government during the Great Depression and the Works Progress Administration, the Federal Writers Project. Right? That's what it's all about. This is her field. So if I say something wrong, please correct me. Okay? So in 1930s, the WPA, the Federal Writers Project, the WPA is there to employ people, to give them jobs during the Depression. And the Federal Writers Project was meant to employ writers, authors, journalists, and others as well. Because they got to eat too, right? They need to be fed as well. Teachers have to eat as well. And essentially what the Federal Writers Project was, well, there's a number of different things. But for our focus, what the Federal Writers Project did was that it went out and it got the life of stories and histories of average everyday people across the country. So in Alabama, these people went out into the Alabama countryside, to the Alabama cities, and they recorded the lives of the people who lived there. Fishermen, sharecroppers, their everyday lives. And this became part of the historical record. Now, eventually, these ideas, these recordings, these interviews, are going to go into what are called guidebooks. But the government's going to keep these records too. The reason why I'm saying this to you is because later on, those records of everyday people are going to become very important when we switch into the idea of social history as a mainstream study of history. By the way, on the right here, this is from the WPA projects. This woman's name is, oh, I'm dying. What is it? I wrote it down. Hold on. Hang on. Florence Thompson. Her name is Florence Thompson. The photographer is a woman named Dorothea Lane. And essentially, Florence was an agricultural worker who was working in California. And to give you an idea of these stories that are emotional about the stories of these average everyday people, whenever I talked about her in class, during our discussion on the Great Depression, I talked about how Florence had to sell the tires of her car in order to feed her children. How they ate frozen peas off the ground in California because they couldn't afford food, and so on and so forth. And so, her story is emotional. Her story carries weight. The story of George Washington, great story, right? But when you talk about Florence and her situation, Florence and what she did, it seems to have a little more emotional gravity to it, something we can maybe relate to as everyday people. And so one of the great things about social history, we'll see a little later on, is that it really appeals to us as, again, average everyday people. They have similar problems that we have, so we seem to be able to connect with them easier than maybe somebody who is a racially landowner. Social history will expand in the 1960s, and again, it kind of starts with the idea of labor and things of that nature. But it will also, because the 1960s, and we all know about the 1960s, period of great upheaval, where we have different groups who are vying for equal rights. I'm thinking of the civil rights movement, women's rights movement. Eventually, the LGBTQ community will advocate for their rights in this world in the 1970s. The Hispanic movement, all these different movements are going to come during the 1960s and advocate for equality. And it just so happens that they're coming at just the right time, because especially if you're interested in history, these people want to know their own pasts. Women want to know about the lives of women in the past. African Americans want to know about the lives of African Americans in the past. Things that have been sort of bypassed by the traditional study and teaching of history. But thanks to social history, now there's room for that. Now people who are interested in studying more about women, or Native Americans, or African Americans, there's room for you to do that in this story. Especially if you go to college, major in history, maybe you go on to get a PhD in history, there is now room for you to decide that I don't want to study politics necessarily in the historical field. I'd rather talk about the African American experience. I'd rather talk about slavery. I'd rather talk about women in the 1940s during World War II. And so the fields open up. Just as social history becomes more and more prominent, it meshes with the 1960s and the rise for equality. And so those two come together almost like peanut butter and jelly. It's beautiful when it happens. It seems so natural that these two things would come together at the exact same time. Which leads me to this. The idea of voices. Because what social history is going to do is make, and I rather not make, but appeal and project and provide new voices. Both those who are writing in history and those who have the stories. Social history will allow both of those to flourish during this period. We'll start with the new voices. Now, what I have here is a more contemporary photograph of the history faculty at Auburn University. My alma mater was the first thing I thought of when I wanted to show you guys an image of diversity in the history profession, to give you an idea of why not everybody even wants to write about George Washington anymore. So, picture this for about 40 years ago, the 1960s, 1970s, and you get an idea of how the field is diversifying. You have not just white men anymore, but you have women, you have people of color, you have people of different ethnicity and nationality, all part of the history program at Auburn University. And they all have their different research interests. Some want to do African American history, some want to talk about women's history, so on and so forth. And so you really see the field open up during this period. History, the study of history, the teaching of history becomes more democratic. 100 years ago, a guy like me could never have been a historian. I couldn't have gotten a PhD. I would not have had the family background. I wouldn't have had the money to do it. And so I've been lucky to get to college. But because of what has happened since then, the 1960s, the rise of the middle class after World War II, the government funding for people to go to college, people like me, who had never had a chance to become a historian, can actually become a historian. Which opens up the field. It's not just racially people who are becoming historians. People such as myself, who came from a lower middle class background, who can now become historians thanks to those programs. And so that allows people like me to enter the field and write from a different perspective. Because it's also about perspective, right? It's no longer just a field of rich white men. It is now the field of the middle class. It's now the field of African Americans. It's now the field of women who have different views on the world. And their views will shape what they want to write and how they want to write it. And so because of that, these stories begin to change. And they begin to look at the past from different perspectives. What they produce, and because of that, will change how the history is told. Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense to you. Since you no longer have people of a homogenous background, rich white men writing about the past, you now have a diversity of people writing about the past, and that's going to change how the past is told. Because now we have people coming at these same topics and themes from different perspectives. I'm going to look at something a lot differently, most likely, than a woman or African American, simply because of my background. So when we study these subjects, we're going to come at them from different perspectives. And because of that, we're going to write differently about it. And then the history we produce is going to look a little bit different, sound like different. So that diversity really allows us to explore topics in a different way, which ends up revisiting, revising the history, and making it sound a little bit different. Look at them. So we have new voices. Those new voices are going to, again, kind of dispel some of the myths, some of the traditional ideas of history. As time goes on, we'll talk about some of those specifically in a second. But also adding to the new voices is the idea of new sources. The idea of where our information comes from. Now, typically, in the research field for history, your information comes from archives, government documents, the letters and journals of people long gone, and that's how you get the story. But typically, those records come from a certain people, usually upper class, usually from the federal government. And for social historians, it's hard to get a social history out of those kinds of documents. They're not documents that reflect the lives of slaves during the pre-Civil War period. They're not documents that reflect the lives of women living in the suburbs in the 1950s and 1960s. And so we have to look for different ways to get this information, to get these new voices. That's exactly what social historians do. They look beyond the archives. They look beyond the museums find information. One of the best ways, I'm going to call it the best ways because I'm not doing it. One of the most effective ways of getting new information is by going directly to the person, directly to the source. To the idea of what's called oral history. Anybody ever heard that term before? Oral history? They got somebody, yes. All right. Yes, the oral history, yes. The idea here is that what we're going to do is we're going to record your life story to get your perspective on the past. Because you are a certain person from a certain group, from a certain community, we want to get your version, your account of the past. Odds are you don't have, unless you keep a journal, odds are you don't have a journal somewhere lying around for us to maybe look at later on. But if we can get your story down, and we can use your story, your story, your story, your story, to compile information in order to advance our research. So what is oral history? The more technical definition of it is something along the lines of an interview designed to provide or to gather your life's history, something along those lines. But the more colloquial, the more easy way to describe it, it's basically just two people sitting down and having a conversation about that. That's what oral history is about. And oral histories are very effective because, number one, they interview people usually who don't really have connections to larger events, people who are, I don't call it common, but people who are, average everyday people. That's where the oral histories tend to come from. They're also more emotional. It's one thing to talk about the Battle of the Bulge in big military history strategy, right? But you can talk to a soldier who lived through the Battle of the Bulge and get their story about what happened. You have a whole new story. You have a first-hand account of somebody who was there, and you get the emotion with their story, which is wonderful. You talk to somebody who went through the civil rights movement. Again, their story is more powerful because they experienced it. I have a video that I was going to show you guys, but it sounds just not going to cut it. But this man who's local, his name is Robert Griffin, was really on the front lines of the civil rights movement in Nashville before he moved here. And he has stories, he was telling me stories during our interview, of how he sat at lunch counters to help integrate lunch counters in Nashville. And how he was basically picked up and thrown on the floor and beaten. Had his glasses broken on his as he was wearing them, due to the violence of him trying to desegregate this lunch counter. So you get these kinds of emotional stories thanks to oral histories. This, by the way, is the godfather of oral histories. His name is Studs Terkel, which he has amazing interviews out there. He's a funny guy, he's a great guy, he's a great documentary on Studs on HBO. I highly encourage you, if you like documentaries, to watch this. Studs Terkel is one of the coolest guys in the world. But he was a great oral historian. In fact, he wrote two really good books that are still used today. The first is called The Good War, which is an oral history of World War II. And the other is called Hard Times, which is an oral history of the Great Depression. So Studs Terkel, again, is kind of the king of all this. But even more important for oral historians, going back to the WPA, the Federal Writers Project, or social historians, was that as the WPA writers went out into the South and interviewed people across the counties of the South, one of the groups they began interviewing were slaves, ex-slaves. In 1930, blah, 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 there were still people alive, African-Americans alive, who had been slaves. And so the WPA gathered their accounts. They interviewed people who had been slaves to get their experiences of what being enslaved had been like. And so thanks to them, we have accounts of slave life. Whenever you want to study the history of slavery, there's not a lot of resources out there from the slave perspective. They didn't leave any documents behind necessarily. But thanks to these interviews, we're able to get a good idea of what it was like to be an enslaved person in the South before the Civil War. So that's a great way, especially for social historians, who want to know more about not just the idea of what the Southern economy was like. We want to know what the lives of slaves were like, the perspective of the slave. Not the plantation owner. Yes? are several online at the Library of Congress from Brunswick, or St. Simon's. They have narratives from people who were enslaved and have been living in St. Simon's. In fact, there are a couple of them that are actually recordings that you hear the audio of. They're online. So yeah, these are still widely available, still used by historians on a regular basis. In fact, this is where I was going to show you the video about me. Let's skip through this. I don't know what time. Okay, so in that case, it's hard to tell here, it's going to talk. I kind of want to start wrapping things up, because now I've told you the story about social history. I've told you how social historians have kind of entered the field, and because of what they've done, the sources they use, how their research and their actions have changed the past. Because the writing they produce, the books they produce, have all sort of rewritten how we see the past. Ideas that have been set in stone by the historians who came before them. The social historians disrupted all of that. And there are a number of different ways to kind of look at this. Two of the biggest disruptions came in Southern history, how we view the South, and then in the history of the U.S. West, how we view Western history. So I want to hit on the South, but we're still talking about the West. And I definitely want to hit the South because we live in the South. And we live in a period now where this is a bit of a contentious issue. The idea of history as it was told to people like my parents, and history as it's kind of told now. There's a disconnect between the two, it seems like. So this will explain to you why this disconnect is there. So we'll start at the beginning then. Not the very beginning. It's always a good place to start, right? We're going to start around the 1880s in this story. So the Civil War is over, slavery is ended, and if you know a little bit about history, there's a period called Reconstruction in the South, where the South was rebuilt, and there were efforts by the federal government and by state governments to put African Americans more in the political system, so on and so forth. And there was a big pushback against that by many of the elite, white elite in the South, who did not like the fact that they were losing their positions of power. So Reconstruction is going to end in 1877 with African Americans generally out of power in the South and the white elite reclaiming power and controlling things for decades to come. That would be the era of Jim Crow. Historians have studied this. They've studied the era of Reconstruction. They've studied slavery. And some of the very first histories of Reconstruction, of slavery, were written in a way that encouraged or approved of what had happened during Reconstruction. The push of African Americans out of power and the resumption of more white elite political power in the South. So how did this history, the idea that Reconstruction, which by the way was seen now as a good thing, the idea that African Americans, especially Republicans in general in the South, were no longer in power because they couldn't handle it, and traditional white elite and Democrats were back in power. How did this story become kind of like part of our everyday lives in terms of history? Well, it starts with this guy right here, William Dunning. Dunning was a historian at Columbia University. He's kind of the father of all of this, because Dunning's main area of interest was Reconstruction. He wasn't Southern, he was from New Jersey, but he was very, very interested in the issue of Reconstruction. And so Dunning will begin his career as a historian by writing about this issue, the Reconstruction era. And in his writing, he's essentially going to say that Reconstruction, or rather the end of Reconstruction, was a good thing. It was good that the rich elite regained power because the Republicans and the African Americans who were in charge during Reconstruction did not know what they were doing. Dunning's a bit motivated by a certain ideology at the time called social Darwinism, scientific racism, which was this idea very prevalent in society. It wasn't some dark corner of the internet. The idea was that certain races, certain groups were inherently superior to others. So Dunning kind of incorporates this, weaves this into his history of the Reconstruction era. And he becomes very popular in the North and the South. He's He's lauded by historical communities, lauded by people who are interested in this sort of thing. Dunning will have students that he teaches as a historian. Southern students who will go back to their southern states in Mississippi, in Georgia, Louisiana, and Alabama, and they will write the history of their states. Some of the first real histories to be written about those states after the Civil War. And because the students are taught by a man named Dunning, this guy, they're going to follow some of his ideas. And whenever they write about the history of their own states, they're going to use some of his language, some of his ideas, to reinforce the idea that Reconstruction was a bad thing. That the Reconstruction governments had no idea what they were doing. That life was better whenever African Americans were not in control. They'll talk about slavery too. It's during this period you get the idea and kind of the written history that slavery wasn't all that bad. It was all said and done. Enslaved people were fed, they had clothes, they had shelter, they had been taken from the wilds of Africa. So all in all, they didn't have it too bad. You get that narrative during this period as well. It becomes more and more mainstream. So this is some of the early groundwork in the history of the South, of enslaved people and of the South during Reconstruction. And this will be the kind of traditional history of the South until the 1950s, 1960s. Children will go to school in the South, read textbooks, be taught by teachers who teach the exact same thing. My parents were Southern, were taught this sort of thing in the 1950s, the 1960s, in their public schools. And so that became the traditional narrative of history of the South, a factual version of events in the South. But that's going to change. It's going to change because other people will begin to write the history. Not just guys like Dunning in 1907. Other people will begin to write the history and look at it from a different perspective. And the reason why I have Birth of a Nation up here, by the way, is also because it's not just Dunning writing this historical narrative, it's also Hollywood, pop culture, promoting the ideas. Anybody know about Birth of a Nation as a movie? You guys have probably heard of it. I don't know if anyone's ever actually seen it. It's on the internet, it's on YouTube. If you want to spend 2 hours watching a silent movie on YouTube, it's there. But basically, Birth of a Nation, if you're not that aware of it, it came out in 1950. It became one of the biggest movies ever. Essentially, Birth of a Nation rewrites history. It shows the KKK as the heroes in the Southern story. It shows the African Americans who are part of the Reconstruction effort to be incompetent, or barbarous, dangerous. And so, in the movie, the KKK basically saves white civilization from these newly freed slaves. And again, people made this up across the country. It became part of the narrative, just like Dunning's work, combined with popular culture, kind of providing this narrative moving forward. But like I said, the story is going to change. People like this. On the left, W.E. Du Bois, who for the longest time was a voice of the wilderness when it came to the other side of the idea of what it was like to be African American in the South. W.E. Du Bois will rail against Dunning and his ideas. He will call it something along the lines of a white Southern fairy tale. What's that? A myth. A myth, absolutely. A myth in all its glory. W.E. Du Bois is writing in the early 1900s. He'll be like almost one of the only people for some time. What changes, though, besides the writings of Du Bois, is that as time moves forward in the story, you have events like the Civil Rights Movement in the 1950s and 1960s, where African Americans are beginning to fight for their rights. They fought in World War II. They've proven their patriotism, their loyalty. They've proven their capability. And they want equal rights just like everybody else has. And along with that fight for equal rights, they'll begin to advocate for a different history. African Americans who go into, because the education field is now open to them, who go into history programs and begin to study their own pasts, will begin to have a different version of events compared to guys like Dunning, who came before. They're going to use the slave narratives that the WPA produced to write these new histories. They're going to come at the issue of slavery from a totally different perspective than guys like Dunning did. The idea of slaves being happy, being well treated, being fed. The slave narratives say something else for the most part. The perspective of African Americans like John Hope Franklin and Kenneth Stamp, who was not African American but wrote a book about slavery called The Peculiar Institution, they're going to turn Dunning and his ideas on their head. They're going to start explaining how slavery really was a horrific thing. African Americans were mistreated, how they were malnourished, how they were beaten. All of that will start coming to light by the 1950s. Again, thanks to new voices like John Hope Franklin and his Stamp, who followed in W.E. Du Bois' footsteps. New voices that change the old narratives, the old myths. And so that's why you see a difference in the history that my mother learned in 1957 compared to what I learned growing up in the South in the 1990s. Because the history has changed, because we've widened the spectrum. There are more voices involved now. There are more sources involved now that were not around when my mom was a teenager. And so, from her point of view, the history has changed. But it wasn't some sort of nefarious idea. History has changed again because the spectrum is wider. More voices are allowed, history is more democratic. And because of that, those myths that have been around in the South about slavery, about Reconstruction, about Southern history, change in the process. And so that's the key. That change, I'm not going to worry about the last, never run out of time. The change here is key. Myth never changes. You can use myth to explain your future by looking at your past. Myth never changes. But history does change. History is always changing. New voices, new sources, new ideas. And that's okay. Because history is supposed to change. History is a product of the moment. The way I look at the history of the world, of America, in this moment is going to be a lot different 20 years from now than one of my students becomes a historian and begins to look at the history of this country. And so my ideas may fall by the wayside as well. And what I think is fact now and see as solid, written in stone, the next person may say, he didn't know what he was talking about. It's going to change again. So when we hear critics, especially in our time of culture war, talk about changing history, how it's negative, it's a negative thing, how we're changing the past. We are. We're changing the past. We're getting around it. But it's part of the process of being historian. We get new information, because that new information can change what we know. We get new people involved. They have different ideas, different perspectives, so the story changes because we have more new people involved. And so while myth may very well be a better way to explain the past, or to use the past to explain the future, history is what we have. And as long as we understand that the basic facts of what, when, who, those all are kind of written in stone, as long as we understand that the why is the part that we shift under us as time goes on, the why is the part that changes over time, we can still use history to explain the world around us. That's all I have.
But if so much of history is mythical, how do you know what to consider history or not history?
That's great. That's a really great question. What is truth? What is fact, right? My students have asked me that too, and I'm still looking for an answer. So you're not the first one to ask that question to me. I would say, how do you know what's true and what's not true? You have to be able to read between the lines a little bit. Know when an author is kind of speaking conjecturally or theorizing, and know whenever they're actually using evidence to support their ideas. Now, if you read the evidence and you believe that their evidence is sound, then maybe that persuades you to accept their ideas, right? And so then for you, that becomes fact. until maybe somebody else comes along and persuades you a different way. So, I don't want to say we live in a backless world because we don't. We definitely live in a world where the ideas of why things happen can change over time. Yes?
There is a way to reach a sort of consensus as well. You have different sources in different areas that aren't saying the same thing. You get a better picture of what might be what we can call sort of fact.
True, but
That's a good point.
some people don't look to a variety of sources.
Yeah.
And glom on to whatever thing fits their idea.
Oftentimes they'll find the sources they agree with.
Right.
That, right? So there's the idea of finding counter sources and then weighing the information and then making your decision.
Well, it seems to me like there are two types of history. And you're talking about social history, but there is a history that is events, where you've got dates.
You're talking about, yes, absolutely, narrative history.
Events, there are things that happened at a certain date in a certain place, and those things don't change, but the social history changes.
Absolutely, yes.
You've got two different topics.
That is true. So, whenever we talk about the idea of narrative history, the fact that Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7, 1941, that's written stuff. Nothing's going to change that unless something really crazy comes up. Nothing's going to change the idea. The fact that Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7th. That's pretty much true in every field of history. Don't change that, you can't change. But you can ask, why was Pearl Harbor bombed? Why did the Japanese decide to bomb Pearl Harbor? You can have different theories on why that happened. And so, again, that's the why part of it.
That's still social.
Well, that's to a degree. So, social would be more about the people involved. The Pearl Harbor, why the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, maybe more of a diplomatic history, more of a political history. But you could probably frame it as a social history if you really want to. Talk about the soldiers, the airmen, and that sort of thing as well. But I think you're on the right track there. Yeah, there are factual events, and you cannot, a new version of history is not going to discredit. But where you can kind of find the squishiness of it all is in the why section of it.
In a university setting, are there two courses of history that are taught? One is based on dates and events and facts that don't change, and the other is social history?
No, it's all sort of.
Mashed together.
You can pick a field at some point. You can choose American history. You can maybe within that choose classes that focus more on people, on the social side of things rather than the political side of things. But there's no track in terms of social history versus non-social history, things like that. As far as I know. What's that?
I follow that. Because I did learn about Pearl Harbor bombing and how revisionist history has changed, even though it's the interpretation of Pearl Harbor. If you're an economic historian, you're going to see it a different way than if you were a government, a historian,
Exactly.
or a military historian, or a social historian, because you're putting key facts at a higher rate than, again, dates for people, what happened didn't change, but the way that the lens we see it through does.
If I were to make a timeline of Pearl Harbor, it would look just like any other historians, no matter what field they were in. They would all look exactly the same. But again, the more conjectural stuff would be able to help in a lot of perspectives on what happened. So.
It just seems like, maybe just because I'm old, and when I took history, it was, you just had to memorize dates and facts.
It was fact-based.
You didn't get into discussions about why did this happen, or how did it affect people, it just wasn't there. That wasn't part of history. It would have been a lot more interesting.
Yeah, I think it's why people dislike history so much because they went through that and just, memorize precedents and facts, right? Know when things happen and know who did them. And so I try to tell my students when we have classes, even at the lower levels, when we're just reading the intro, it's like, guys, I don't care if you remember what date something happened, but I really want us to talk more about, again, that kind of like spongy stuff, the why things happen. That's when we can have discussions about things. And talk about, the why. And that's where we can have different opinions, that come out from political perspectives, different racial perspectives, and then by talking about those different perspectives, we get a whole clearer idea of maybe what happened and how we see the past. Because every time we talk about the past, we're comparing it to a moment in our own lives. We see see no past through the lens of our own moment. So we have to keep that in mind too. Our own biases, the things going on around us right now, those color how we see the past to a certain degree. You never get the bias out of history, no matter how much people want it to be objective. We're still going to have some bias there at some point, whether we want it or not.
So are you teaching both, putting the time frame in and then doing the social?
Yeah, exactly. So whenever I teach U.S. history at the basic level, what I try to do is give them a time frame. This happened, this happened, this happened. And then go back in and talk about maybe we just finished up today, for instance, we just finished up the history of World War I. And I talked about, the elements that led to the U.S. entering the war. But then I also talked about today, especially, about what happened here in the home front during World War I. Not necessarily about the battles overseas, which are important, but I spent more time talking about how during this time period, during World War I, there's a lot of anti-German hostility. And a lot of Germans were hurt, some were lynched and killed. German school.
Yeah, we were never about that stuff.
Oh, really? Like Germans had to change their names. One poor German was forced to kiss the flag.
Oh, yeah, no, I know now as an adult.
Yeah.
It was the school, being in school, it was that aspect.
So we try to show that as well. And my goal by showing that is not to try to diminish the United States or anything like that. My goal is to provide a fuller, comprehensive story, and then hopefully that intrigues them enough to want to go out and read more about it, find out more about it. Because like you guys said, the facts, it's great for bar trivia, but it doesn't necessarily kind of stir the soul, right? To go find out more. My goal, to a certain degree, is to stir the soul to get you to go out and do more.
So would sort of the changing aspect of history be like in World War I, a lot of black people went to Europe and fought, and they were welcomed and they were treated with respect and dignity and all that. And they fought for their country, and then they came home expecting to still have some of that dignity and respect, and it wasn't there. It was just squashed as they had it before. So is that something that comes up now in a more changing present discussion, or have you not even done there because of Black Lives Matter?
No, actually we talked about that today too. We talked about how a group called the Harlem Hellfighters, using this example of this, who went overseas and performed admirably during the battles that they were in, came back. And the idea was that these guys were never actually thanked or rewarded for their service in the United States. The French loved them, but they were never really rewarded for their service here. And we talked about that. And I spent not a lot of time, because we're going to get into more civil rights later on. But I spent today trying to explain that these soldiers, African American soldiers, 500,000 strong, who came back from France after the war, these guys are going to be the tip of the spear whenever the civil rights movement really kicks in the 1920s, because of their experiences in France. Like you said, kind of feeling that equality that they felt amongst the French, coming back to a place where they are essentially second-class citizens, they're going to be the guys who will lead the fight, push once the war is over. Get back. So we do a little bit of that too.
And are your college level students, they had those discussions in high school?
Not that I can tell. I asked them today, who has heard about the Harlem Hellfighters? One person raised their hand. She learned about it in school. I also did the Tulsa Massacre, the Tulsa 1921 Tulsa race riot. And remember, it's popular now to talk about that. When I started teaching 4 years ago, and I would ask that question in class, nobody had ever heard of it. So that's changed a little bit too. They are being more than it seems like at the high school level to a certain degree. Excellent question. Anything else? All right, well,
Thank you, Dr. Montford.
What's that?
Thank you for coming and speaking tonight.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, thank you guys again so much for showing up. I know it's nasty outside, so I really appreciate it. It's my pleasure to talk to you guys and learn something out of it. Got something out of it. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. Thank you so much.
No, it's very